So that is one of the first important differences between Europe, Japan, and China is the scale of the warfare and how important will the elite, warriors be if they can kill a lot of soldiers. And in China, frankly, it makes very little difference. Instead, tactical approach or strategy means more in the outcome of a battle. And so that will be the first reason why I don't believe that wrestling is that important to Chinese olden day warfare. Next, let's take a look at the method of war throughout Chinese history, and let's examine how viable is wrestling in these different areas of battle approach. So first, let's look at the Western Zhou dynasty. Right, during that era, one of the most predominant weapons they used for troops is something called ge, and ge looks something like this. And I believe in English, I think they translated to this as a dagger axe, but personally, I think it's more similar to a pickle axe. Basically, it's similar to the thing that miners use to pick rocks. As to why this was originally the melee weapon used, most likely is because it comes directly from the agriculture tool where they use to plow the land. Right? You can see that if in the beginning they use that to whack somebody, then they might evolve that into a more dedicated weapon, but with the same kind of design and mechanic. And here is the author's rendition of what soldiers look like pre-Western Zhou dynasty. Now I know we are busy talking about Western Zhou dynasty, but let's start by looking at what soldiers looked like before Western Zhou era. But anyway, in this depiction, you can see that this kind of troops, they basically have a ge and they have a shield. And if you use some kind of common sense and logic, you can think that during that time, there is a fairly good chance that wrestling will become important. Because this weapon such as ge, it has a very small area of attack. Meaning if I whack you with it, if you rush forward and you miss that point, the rest of the weapon has no harm to you. So it makes it easier for you to gauge in the close quarter and wrestle the guy. So if someone is fighting during that time, and for somehow he lost his weapon, then there's a fairly good chance that if he can either block that blow with a shield or just charge in and grab the guy, and he can basically wrestle him to the ground and maybe take that weapon from him and kill that person with it instead. So during that kind of warfare, it kind of makes sense why they would use wrestling. But later on, when they start to transition from ge into sword for foot soldiers, then wrestling becomes more dangerous because a sword, the entire thing can be a threat. So it's not as easy to basically charge in and avoid the point that can hurt you. The whole thing can hurt you at any range, even at close range. You can still slit somebody with a sword, which makes wrestling during battle a far greater risk. Now, another thing to keep in mind that even though when you talk about Western Zhou dynasty as well as Spring, Autumn, and Warring State, people naturally think about ge as the most fundamental weapon. But in actuality, throughout Chinese history, bow and arrow has always been the most important weapon. The only reason why people nowadays think that is these melee weapons is because you see this more in movies and TV series. And that's because it looks cooler for the main characters to charge into a crowd and whack them with melee weapon. But according to actual record, archery has always been the most fundamental means of battle for Chinese civilization. Because of course, if you can kill somebody from far away, why would you risk to get closer? That just doesn't make sense. Which is also why earlier when we talk about the sixth art of nobility, it has archery, it has chariot handling, but it doesn't have sword, it doesn't have ge, and it doesn't have wrestling. That just shows you how important archery is. Ever since bow and arrow was invented, it has become the most important means of battle. And of course, if you are using archery, you have no use for wrestling. Even though ge is considered one of the most basic and important weapon of ancient China, we can see examples of this in our own language, such as the saying 大动干戈, where 干戈 refers to conflict, but if you break it up, 干 refers to shield and ge refers to this dagger, axe, pickle axe kind of weapon. So from this we can see that when we're talking about conflict, the language itself refers to ge. However, Ever since chariot became the main method of war during the Zhou dynasty and onwards up until the Han dynasty, Ge actually has taken a back seat for weapons that are more adapted as chariot warfare. And here you can see a depiction of classical chariot during the Zhou and Spring Autumn after the Warring State period. Basically, they'll either have 2 horses or 4 horses, depending on how rich the kingdom is, and you have 3 nobilities mounting on the chariot. The center guy, his sole purpose is to control the chariot and go and charge at the enemy ranks. While the guy on his left is an archer, and he is actually the main damage dealer in the type of warfare. Even though they are traveling on chariot, the goal is actually to shoot the enemy dead before they reach close quarter. So he is the main damage dealer, the main attacker. And the guy on the right of the chariot handler, he will use a ji. Ji is basically a more advanced weapon evolved from Ge. Ge is a weapon that pokes downwards. Ji is a weapon that has the pickaxe function, but also has another tip on top that you can thrust people. So that when the chariots collide, then it's up to the guy on the right with the ji to try to pick off opponent from the opposing chariot. In those days, they'll have chariot formation on both sides. They'll make formation and they'll both be ready, and then they will charge at each other, almost like jousting, except they're not riding horses, but they're controlling on chariot. And they'll basically pass each other, turn around, and do it again. And you can see that through this whole charging, archers will fight at each other first, and then when they finally meet, the guy with the ji, or you can, I think in English they call it halberd, will try to pick out some people, they'll pass and turn around, and they'll shoot at each other again, and then when they get close, they'll try to poke at each other again. And when they are wealthy enough, they also have a short sword, which they use in case they lost their pole arm, or in case that they fell off the chariot and had to engage in close quarter combat. But based on this, if we use some common sense to look at it and think about it, so we can see that at this point, wrestling is no longer that useful in the military combat approach. Because if you are unfortunate enough to fall off the chariot, you are still facing with other people on chariot. And how are you going to wrestle somebody that is not on foot? Right? So pretty much if you fell off the chariot, you're probably going to be stampeded by horses or get run over by the chariot wheels. A lot of bad things will happen to you before you can use your wrestling skill. Even if it so happens that 2 nobilities both fell off the chariot at the same time, there's still no safe zone for them to actually wrestle. If you're on your feet, at least you can try to evade and dodge incoming chariots and save yourself. But if you're wrestling with someone, that becomes impossible, and there's a very high chance you'll be run over and trampled by horses or chariot or both. Which is why, even though in my previous part I've stated that there has been record during the Zhou dynasty regarding military training wrestling, but based on this we can see that it cannot have been that important or even mainstream. Simply because the method of combat, aka chariot, it just simply has no room for people to wrestle. And this can also explain why, even though chariot handling and archery is considered part of the 6th art of nobility, wrestling is not. And another thing that doesn't add up during the Zhou and Spring Autumn all the way to Warring State period is that the nobilities, they are required to wear traditional huaxia clothes, which is some kind of skirt at the bottom. They don't actually have pants, it's actually a skirt. So over here you can basically see an actual historical depiction during those periods where the nobilities are training archery. And you can see that through the artwork you can see that clearly they're wearing some kind of skirt that goes all the way to the feet, if not to the ground. And you can imagine that if you are wearing that kind of clothes, you're not really suited for on foot combat, and most certainly not suited for any type of wrestling. You're gonna trip over your own skirt, and that is supported by the nobility's main method of combat, which is on a chariot. You're basically standing on it, and you don't need to move around. And if you fall off from it, you're most likely dead anyway. So that they don't see a big problem to wearing skirts to battle. Well, if you look at historical depictions of wrestling, they're all shown in wearing some kind of sumo-like shorts and have no clothing on their torso. Even though these depictions are from ceremonial or competition events and not from actual battle, but from this we can still see that the people then realize that the traditional skirt-like clothing is a great hindering towards their ability to wrestle. So the point here is that if wrestling was all that important in the battle, they would have adjusted the clothing to better suit this method of combat, like what they did later on when they moved from chariot into horse riding, which we'll discuss in more detail in just a bit. But the fact that they didn't further shows you that wrestling can't have been that important. Right, according to record, behind each chariot and three nobility, there follows some common soldier who are basically farmers who are also drafted for war. In the beginning there's around 7 farmers following one chariot, but at some point in history there can be up to 70 farmers following the chariot. And they are armed with a weapon called shu. Right, this word is actually not used much in Chinese language anymore. Most Chinese don't even know what this pronunciation is, and shu refers to a very old form of a wooden stick or like a club. And the reason why these farmers, soldiers, are using a wooden club instead of ge or ji or anything else is because during those days, bronze is a very rare commodity. So there are not enough bronze to go around to arm every peasant soldier, which is why they go to the next thing that is hard and easily accessible, which is wood, and therefore they make wooden clubs. So it is likely that these peasants will be able to use wrestling because you can't really kill somebody with a wooden club with one shot. And chances are if you have two people whacking each other with a wooden stick, they'll most likely run into each other and result in wrestling range. However, the problem that doesn't add up here is that these peasants or farmers, they are not full-time military personnel. Unlike the nobility, they basically don't have to work, right? They get money from the land which is worked by these farmers. So they don't have to work, and their sole job is to get educated in the 6 arts, and should the country needs or the kingdom needs them to go to war, they will take up arms and go to war. So that is their job. Whereas these farmers, during their everyday life, they have to farm. And if you know, farming is a dedicated job 3 seasons out of a year, and you have to work from sunrise to sundown, and it's very physically taxing and exhausting. So I don't believe these farmers would have the time to practice wrestling and club work on the side of doing the annual farm work. And keep in mind that they also have to pay tax to the nobilities. So even though it will make sense that they would make use of wrestling during combat, but I don't think they actually have the time or the dedication to do that. And according to record, most of the time when the chariot are depleted, right, whether because chariot back then weren't made that sturdy, so when they clash into each other, sometimes the wheel fall off, sometimes the people fall off and they get killed off. But whenever the one side has no functioning chariot left, then the battle is decided. So these farmers, they don't have to fight to the death. They're basically just following the chariot, to both their numbers. So a lot of times they don't even try their best to fight. They basically just follow, run around, and avoid getting killed, and let the nobilities fight it out. So that's another reason why I don't see them have actual reason to train hard in wrestling and other martial skill so that they can actually kill people in battle. They're not going to get awarded. Right? No matter how well a farmer performs in battle, he's still a farmer for life. His son is still a farmer for life. There's no reward for performing well in battle, which is another reason why I don't believe they would train wrestling during that period. And as the period goes from Western Zhou to Spring Autumn to Warring State, during Warring State period, Zhao Kingdom, they are on the northern side of China at the time, and they basically encounter raid from Huren, right? Huren is basically a blanket term Chinese use for nomad people living on the grassland north of what's known as China at the time. And the Zhao kingdom in particular suffered a lot from these nomad people's raids. These nomad people would basically come and pillage villages, steal food, take the women, and then they'll basically run. And these nomads, they don't fight on chariots. Instead, they are horse riders. So when the Zhao kingdom was fighting against the northern nomads, they've come to realize that chariot sucks ass against riders because its maneuverability and its speed is much slower than what a human can accomplish on a single horse. So they lose on mobility, they lose on maneuverability, and if they're not in a flat piece of land, chariot simply does not work. Which is why one of the king of the Zhao kingdom called Zhao Wu Ling Wang, his most famous historical achievement is called Hufu Qi She. While Qi She refers to riding and horse archery, Hufu refers to the northern nomad garment. So basically during his time, he realized that the chariot warfare is inferior to the nomad horse riding archery approach to warfare. But due to the fact that Han people at the time, or Chinese people at the time, were clothing with long skirt and long sleeve, it is actually impossible to ride horses and shoot arrows in those kind of garments. So he actually forced his entire nation to adopt the nomad type of clothing, which is pants and short sleeve, when they go to war. And this is later on considered one of the greatest evolution of military approach during the Warring State period. And this further shows you that if the main method of war changes, the Chinese people would adopt the wear and garments to suit the new method of war. The fact that they did not make such adjustment for wrestling further shows you that wrestling could not have been that important like some people claim. And after other six kingdoms saw the efficiency of the Zhao kingdom's cavalry, they also started to have their own cavalry. But of course at that time, chariot is still being used. It wasn't like cold turkey overnight, everybody went to cavalry. But there's a slow revolution changing from chariot to riders. And up to the Han dynasty, they no longer use chariot for warfare. They still use it to transport goods, but when they go to war, they ride horses instead of their horses pulling a chariot behind it. From Western Zhou to Spring-Autumn Warring State and then to Han dynasty, the blacksmithing skill improved greatly. So slowly, instead of using a 30 centimeter to 50 centimeter long short bronze sword, people start to make the weapon longer. Historians have discovered that the Qing kingdom has bronze sword that goes up to 90 centimeter. And later on, when iron alloy were used to make these weapons, for example during the Han dynasty, the length of the sword exceeded over 1 meter. And that further takes away the need for wrestling in warfare, because as the weapon gets longer, you can kill somebody from a longer distance, and therefore there's less chance of you colliding with them while wielding a wooden stick or even a ge, which have very small area of damage. And the chance of soldiers colliding into each other and using wrestling is even less. And of course, around those periods, they also invented crossbow. So not only do they have a bow and arrow archery, they also have crossbow. For those of you that don't know, archery is great in terms of loading speed, so arrow per minute, but it is much harder to master. It takes years to train a proper archer. Whereas the crossbow, well, it's much slower to load, but it is actually much easier to aim. And during those days, they have the seasoned soldiers being archers, but the newly recruits will be basically given crossbow. They have both bow and arrow and crossbow, and that is the main mode of combat, and is supported by melee weapons. You can see why wrestling is even less useful during that setup. Another very important thing to consider is that ever since the Warring State to Han dynasty, to Tang dynasty, to Song dynasty, all the way to Ming dynasty, the biggest threat to China has always been the nomad from the north. During the Han dynasty, almost all the wars other than the Civil War right? All the war against foreigners were conducted against the Hans. For example, the first emperor of Han dynasty, Han Gaozu Liu Bang, around the year 200 BC, led his army, which consists of around 320,000 men, against the then tribal leader of the Han group called Modu Chanyu. Eventually, he was surrounded on Baideng Mountain for 7 days and he could not defeat the Han troop. Eventually, he was forced to bribe his way out and allowing the Han troops to agree to retreat. And that started a 3-generation of tradition where the Han dynasty would pay tribute to the Han tribes in order to leave them alone. At the time, majority of the Emperor Liu Bang's troops were infantry, while the entire troop of Modu Chanyu's Han force are cavalry. And this is one of the major reasons why the Han Emperor suffered such a defeat, besides the fact that he also underestimated his opponent. And it's not just the Hans, but every other northern nomad group that China ever went to war with, they all favors cavalry, and most of them are horse archers. While there are some cases where they also have heavy cavalry that charge into enemy rank, but those are less common. Majority of the time, these nomad people prefer to have horse archery and range attack, and the curved blade, which can happen later on, are mostly reserved for catching up to fleeing enemies and cleaving them while they are trying to get away. It is not for them to charge head-on into the enemy. One of the main reasons for this is because nomad people usually lack blacksmithing skill and therefore have less armor compared to the Chinese dynasties, and therefore they are at a severe disadvantage should the two forces collide head-on. Another reason is because the nomad people have less sustainable ability for casualty, right? Their population growth is much less than the Chinese dynasty, which is why they can't risk losing casualty and members to the Han people. In fact, during the Han dynasty, part of the reason why eventually the Han dynasty won against the Hans is because they had more lives to spare. And the population growth of the Han tribes just simply could not upkeep with the amount of lives the Han dynasty was throwing at them. And you can see why the Han troops cannot beat them, because they're on foot, these guys are on horses, and they are ranged attackers. They ride horses, they shoot. If you try to come close, they will run away or they will flank. You're never able to catch them, and all at the same time, you're receiving arrows. Even though the Han troops, they have archers as well, but they are foot archery. And foot archery can't attack while on the move, right? Horse archery can move while shooting. The foot archery have to chase them, stop and shoot, but by then they're already gone. Under that context, you can clearly see why wrestling serves even less purpose than Western Zhou spring-autumn to warring state. When facing with these riders, you pretty much win if you can catch up to them. You can kill them with any type of pole arm because they are not well armored and they are not well versed in melee combat. But the biggest problem that China were facing at the time was how to catch up to these riders. And consider that during the Han dynasty, their troops have to tend to their own farming when they are not actively at war. They only take up arms when there is invasion or war to fight. Otherwise, they have to plant their own food. They are not given food by the government. And based on that, you can again see that the majority of the time, these troops are spent farming the land. Right? Again, farming is a full-time job, 3 seasons out of a year. And on the off days, they will be training archery, crossbow, formation, pole arm, and possibly short melee weapon if they have more time. But they will not be training wrestling because that is the least of their concern. Considering how pointless it is against these northern nomad riders, and even if it's against themselves, against their fellow civil war using spear formation, wrestling is still pretty useless. So the Han dynasty had to bribe their peers with jewelries, gold, silver, and marriage up until Han Wudi period. Basically what changed then is that during the emperors before Han Wudi, they basically tried to work on the agriculture, work on the economy, and during Han Wudi's time, the Han Dynasty is very rich, right? It's recorded in the text that there's so much grain in the storeroom that some of them has already gone off. And you know, grain, unlike meat, can actually last a very long time. So for that to gone off, it means that they have never needed for the reserve grain for many, many years. And the money, right, back then they use copper coins, and the money they used to string them together with a rope, right? So the money that were reserved in the Han Dynasty governmental bank, the rope that's used to string the money has eroded away. That just shows you that how long they have a need to take reserve money out of the central bank, so to speak. So that's how much wealth they've accumulated, and at the same time, they're also accumulating horses. So during Han Wudi's time, right, at its peak, they had 600,000 war horses, right? And keep in mind, this war horse is not regular horse, the horse that you use to drag the wagons, to transport goods, to plow the land. Sometimes they can't use in war. War horses are breeded and trained and raised separately. So with 600,000 war horse and riders who can master cavalry and archery, Han Wudi basically mounted multiple campaigns against the Hans. And what we can see from this is that Han Wudi realized that you cannot beat the nomad riders with infantry. You need to have riders just like them. You have to beat them with their own game. And this is not to say that infantry are completely useless, but even though they take a larger number and portion of the military force, but they're more like a supporting role. The battle is mostly dependent by how well the cavalry force perform rather than how well the infantry perform. And when facing against enemy cavalry forces, the infantry's best method of war and choice of weapon is bow, crossbow, and then long polearms such as spear formation. Nothing else really matters or makes a difference, and this further illustrates how pointless wrestling would be in that type of warfare. And according to record, one of the Han Wudi's most successful general called Huo Qubing, his tactic on defeating the Hans is that he will have his main horse archery chasing the Hans or engaging them in battle, and then he will have flankers to ride out and surround that group of Han troops. And once they cut off the retreat, then they'll force them into melee combat. The Hans are better at archery than the Chinese because they are born into a hunter-gatherer kind of community, so they learn how to shoot animals from childhood. Whereas the Chinese soldiers, the Hans, they learn how to plow the land from childhood. So the archery, no matter how much you train, you can't be better than people who are born into archery. However, the Hans are not very skilled at close quarter combat. But in case you think, okay, that's basically when they will stop using wrestling, that's not the case. So basically what Huo Qubing did is he will have his flankers cut off the back of those enemy, force them into melee range, and they will kill them with horse lance. And here you can see some actual historical depictions of how the Han riders fought off the Han riders. So the first thing to notice here is that the Han riders only has bow and arrow, so that they don't actually have melee weapon, and the Han people have to chase up to them or to flank them, and then lance them off their horse with the Chinese ji, which is like the Chinese version of halberd, which served the same function as a regular lance and was eventually replaced by Chinese horse lance or spear because the part that you hack people with, it just became obsolete and useless in this type of horse warfare. At this point, it should be pretty obvious that in the Han military setup, the most important military skill, if you're a rider, is obviously riding, and then horse archery, and then horse lancing. And if you're infantry, then it is bow, crossbow, spear formation, short melee weapon should the need arise, but there's basically no reason to do wrestling. And of course, there are always going to be exceptions to the norm. For example, there were instances where infantry troop has beat back cavalry, but they do so by adopting good formation, protect themselves with shields, then attack them with bow and arrow, crossbow, and then spear and other polearms. None of the recorded battle where infantry defeated cavalry was there any type of wrestling used. So at this point, the big question you should ask yourself is, why would the Han Dynasty military waste time training wrestling when they're never actually going to use it in the type of battle that they engage in? So the answer here should be pretty obvious to you already. And of course, that the same model of combat will be carried over among Chinese people's own civil war. I mean, obviously they still have infantry troops, when they fight against themselves, but most of the time the battle is decided by cavalry, by the advantage of cavalry rather than foot soldier. Foot soldier is just there to basically fill in the blanks. And most of the important battles that is worthy of recording in history the victory are determined by the usage of the cavalry. And the same thing happens during the Tang Dynasty. Instead of the Hans, the Tangs had to fight against the Turks. And the Turks, just like every other northern nomad group that invaded China before them and after them, are mostly cavalry forces and horse archers, but at that point they also started to use lancing. They're very little and sometimes no infantry force at all. And therefore the only way to beat them for the Tang Dynasty is to have riders themselves. Just like the Han Dynasty, they also have their own cavalry forces, as well as infantry force that make use of shield, spear formation, bow, and crossbow. With the addition of something called Mo Dao, while no one knows anymore what this blade looks like, but according to historical record, it is a long pole-arm horse-cutting type of weapon that's designed specifically against cavalry forces. And according to Tang record, during the defending battle of Chang'an against the rebel force of Anlushan, the crossbowmen were given Mo Dao as a secondary arm. And what they will do is they will basically shoot at the incoming cavalry force with the crossbow, and once the cavalry get close enough, they will abandon the crossbow and take up the Mo Dao, and they will try to cut down the remaining cavalry forces that reaches their formation. And this has reportedly to have been a great success against the Anlushan cavalry force. So this is unlike the previous war against nomad people, because Anlushan's troops, they're not only horse archers, they're also horse lancers, which is why battle do get into melee range. But you can see that if you are infantry and you are facing against a rider, wrestling is pretty useless, right? Instead, you need to have almost like the Western pikemen, but in China it's spearmen, or you have crossbow, and then you have Mo Dao or other blade weapons that can use to cut horses' legs. And when the riders do fall off the horses, you can just pretty much kill them with your weapon. You don't have to go wrestle them, so the chance of using wrestling is almost next to zero. Not much change during the Song Dynasty. They basically, ever since the establishment of Song Dynasty, they have been fighting with Liao, with Xixia. They're both nomad people. And later on, they've been fighting with Jin, with another tribe of nomad people, and eventually Mongolians that came over and wiped out the loss of the Song Dynasty's control over the land. And again, this is very clearly recorded in history that the Liao people, the Jin people, and the Mongolians, they use horse and archery. And during that time, they are also equipped with a curved blade, which they only use when they basically are chasing fleeing soldier. Basically, when the battle starts, they'll basically try to use horse archery to pick up people. And when the Song people start to flee, then they will come in behind and cut them with curved blades. With the exception of Jin people, right? They're one of the rare cases where they used real heavy cavalry, which back then is called the Iron Pagoda, 铁浮屠. According to history, the Jin people has around 3,000 Iron Pagoda riders, and they are basically chained. About 3 riders are chained together, horse to horse, with iron chains with possibly spike balls between them. And they'll basically charge into the Song infantry, and basically and the horse wears armor, the rider wears armor, and they have lances. So that's almost like impenetrable war. And by linking 3 riders into one, not only the rider would knock over infantry, the iron chain, possibly with spikes, would then also cleave through the infantry troops. So that was one of the very devastating tactics that the Jin people used. At the same time, they were still true to their roots and has a type of horse archery, what they call 拐子马, which are basically light cavalry that will be used to flank the Song troops while the heavy cavalry Iron Pagoda charges the front line. And in case you're wondering why the Song didn't use cavalry, is because during the Song dynasty, horses are very scarce. And that's because they lost the northern land, which is used to raise horses, to the Jin people. And so they were being forced to move to the south. And the south land, first of all, they don't have good breed on war horses, and secondly, they don't have the land to train these horses. So the Song dynasty almost had no rider, and that's why they did very badly against the nomad people. Now, just to give an example to illustrate my point. Now, while this incident was not against the Jin people, but instead against the Liao kingdom, but it is a snapshot of what mostly happens when the Song troops fight against any nomad group from the north. During the year 979 AD, Song Taizong Emperor led a force of 100,000 men against a Liao force of 9,000 cavalry, and he lost it all. This loss is largely due to the fact that the Song Taizong troops were infantry and the Liao troops were all cavalry, which shows you how when infantry versus cavalry, they're at a severe disadvantage, especially when they're ill prepared. So against these heavy cavalry Iron Pagoda of the Jin people, what the famous Southern Song Dynasty's military general Yue Fei did was, first of all, when he knows where he needs to defend against them, he plowed the land, pour water through them, and makes them into rice field. Basically, it's almost like swampy-like land, so that the horses can't really run too well. Then, from this illustration, which isn't historically accurate, but it should give you the good idea, is that they will have true infantry troops with shield for defense, and then they will have other troops with long blade, where the name horse cutting blade come from, 斩马刀, and they'll basically use those to try to cut off the horse's leg. But you can see the horse is fully armored, so it's very hard to damage the horse except its leg, so that's where they aim for. And something else that you don't see on this painting is that there are also other troops with a type of spear that has a hook on the side, which they use to hook off the soldier, the enemy's helmets, so that they can stab them into the face. So this is the kind of tactic that Yue Fei deployed, which actually defeated this invincible Iron Pagoda formation. And then because of that, eventually the Jin people stopped using this. Unfortunately, this was not enough to stem the tide and save Song Dynasty from Jin people's invasions. But that's a separate topic, maybe for another day. What we can see from this is that against these heavy cavalry charging in front and light cavalry with archery flanking the side, there's absolutely no place to make use of any form of wrestling. If you can get those guys off their horses, you pretty much already halfway won the battle. And with the light cavalry, if you can actually catch up to them, you pretty much won the battle. Those are actually the hard things. It's not how you can beat them in the melee range with wrestling. That is not important in this context at all. So eventually the Jin people were annihilated by the Mongolians, and so was the Song people, and eventually China was united under the Yuan dynasty, the rule of the Mongolians. And here is where a lot of people make a mistake, right? Mongolians are famous for their wrestling, and often people in China would then say the Mongolians, they probably ride horses, they try to attack you with the curved blade, and then they'll get on their foot and they'll wrestle you. And just imagine how scary it is to have a 200-pound Mongolian wrestler charging at you. Unfortunately, this is not historically accurate at all. This is completely fantasy and imagination. According to all the records that I can find, both in China as well as in Europe, right? Because keep in mind the Mongols invaded towards Europe as well. It is said that they actually conquered a third of the world. So according to accounts and records on both sides, the Mongolians mostly are light cavalry. They don't even have heavy cavalry. A lot of the troops don't even have metal armor. Some just wear a leather armor. And their main tactic is horse archery. They have 5 horses, they have great archery, and when the people are on the run, they'll reap them with curved blade, but don't actually engage battle head on. And you can imagine against the type of warfare where they actually wear heavy armor to go head on against them, that's pretty suicidal. Which is why the Mongolians win by archery and fast horses and massive swamp-like attack. It is very counterproductive for any Mongolian to attempt to wrestle someone, because by the time you get down the horse and wrestle with someone, the rest of his buddies and comrades would have already left him miles behind. Speed is the essence for any Mongolian military campaign. In fact, it is recorded in Chinese history that the Mongolians, each rider has 3 horses at least. One for normal riding between places, second for carrying his stuffs, and the third is the best among the horses, which is the war horse that he reserves and only ride that horse when they are charging into battle. So imagine a Mongolian force where each rider has 3 horses at least. Why on earth will any of them choose to fight on foot? Even if the war horse get killed in battle, they still have other horses to spare. Which is why, based on common sense, we can already know that it is impossible that Mongolians actually favors wrestling in the military tactic. Then we move on to Ming Dynasty. Now, like I've mentioned earlier, there is one particular text at least that mentions about Ming military. It basically ties Ming military to wrestling. But I've already said, it's unclear based on the wording that whether or not wrestling is actually an important military training for their troops, or it's just kind of like a recreational activity that they do on the side. However, what we do know is that when the Ming people, when the Chinese people overthrown the Yuan Mongolians and eventually established Ming Dynasty, firearm was one of the very important tools that ensured the Ming people's victory. Now, of course, the firearm at that time is very primitive, as nowhere near what we know as firearms today. But still, against the less civilized Mongolians, the primitive firearms did wonders. And of course, you can imagine, against cavalry again, right? There's no room to do wrestling. And even if you do get the Mongolian guy off his horse, they've been wrestling since childbirth, right? So it's pretty stupid for any Chinese to attempt to beat Mongolians in their own game. So that's why it's counterintuitive for the Ming troops to actually use wrestling as an important means of warfare. And again, the most important piece of evidence about Ming Dynasty we can see from General Qi Jiguang's 绩效新书, right? It is very famous by now that in his book 绩效新书, chapter about fist technique, 全经节要, he explicitly said that fist techniques or anti-hand combat is not useful for large-scale warfare. However, it is useful for suppleness, coordination, and basic training to prepare the troop for real military weaponry training. And there are actually a lot of wrestling supporters in China who use this as an evidence to further support their belief that, you see, even General Qi Jiguang says that 拳法 is useless in warfare. And because the other texts recorded that the Ming troops trained wrestling, and therefore wrestling must be more important. However, this is actually pretty stupid, because if you look through the entire 绩效新书, the military manuscript of General Qi Jiguang, there isn't even a chapter on wrestling. Even though he said 拳法 isn't useful, he at least had the chapter dedicated to 拳法, and he did at some stage teach his troops those 32 postures of his 全经节要. However, he did not see the need to even talk about wrestling or teach wrestling to his troops. So what does this actually tell you about what General Qi Jiguang think about wrestling in the military? And from this you can see that a lot of these wrestling supporters in China, they know so little about history and logical thinking that they're actually using something to prove their cause, but in the meantime, the very statement that they're flunking around actually disproves their position. Now, of course, you can say that General Qi is only one general out of the entire 200 some year of Ming rule, and therefore he can't represent every general's position on wrestling in the military, which is probably true. But again, if you just use some basic logic and rational thinking and look at the method and mode of warfare during the Ming Dynasty, whether it is against the Mongolian forces, against the Japanese pirates, against Japanese shogun force that invaded Korea, or even among Ming people themselves in the civil conflict, the main method of war is either cavalry force, or firearm, or archery, or crossbow, or spear formation. There's no room for any type of wrestling or other close-range unarmed combat. And after that, we move on to the Qing dynasty. Again, there's a lot of confusion here because the Qing people really love their wrestling. However, they got this habit from the day they used to hang out with the Mongolians, right? When the Mongolians ruling over China, the Yuan dynasty, the Qing people, they were kind of like a subgroup of people that falls under the Mongolian rule. So from there, they basically picked up this kind of sport from the Mongolians. There's actually a record talking about how initially the Qing people can't win in the annual wrestling tournament against the Mongolians, but eventually after many years of training, they're eventually able to do well against the Mongolian wrestlers and eventually win. And you can see that it's actually quite an important sport for the Manchurians at the time, which naturally after they took over China, they keep this habit, right? Every year, the imperial cities, they will have wrestling competition, and they will have good reward for the winners. In fact, they have special professional wrestling camps that is stationed near the capital called Shanpu Ying, and people in there are professional Manchurian wrestlers that get paid to train wrestling. And this is where often the confusion comes in, that is, because they are these military camps that train wrestling, therefore the Manchurians must favor wrestling in battle. But if you look through the actual military manuscript, you can see that again, there's no mention of wrestling. And if you again use logic and think about this, right, at that time, if they're not using riders, archery, then they are using foot soldiers with long spear. And also, following from the Ming dynasty, firearm has also been quite predominant in the military structure. And out of all these methods of warfare, wrestling yield very, very little result and benefit, if not completely nothing at all. So again, the common sense will dictate that the Qing military troops most likely did not train wrestling, at least not for battle. They might train it for the Manchurians, they might do it for their own hobby, for competition, for events, but it was not, if any of the soldiers trained wrestling, it was not for combat. So this is a quick rundown on the method of warfare that Chinese people have conducted from the beginning of the Western Zhou dynasty all the way to the Qing dynasty. And the conclusion we can draw is that the way they engage battle does not really need wrestling at all, which is why, based on common sense and rational thinking, we can conclude that most likely none of these dynasties' troops really cared about how good your wrestling skill is. Now you might wonder, how is this different from the Japanese samurais, right? Why do they have armored throwing techniques while China did not? To better understand this question, we will need to look at how the Japanese mainly conducted their warfare and how that differs to the Chinese method of war that we have been discussing up to this point.